The will of King George III. King George III reigned from 1760 until his death in 1820, and he was the longest reigning monarch of Britain at the time. His reign, which spanned over 60 years, saw numerous transformations in British society and politics. However, George III's later years were marred by a series of mental health crises, which became increasingly severe beginning around 1801 and culminating in the early 1810s. His mental illness severely impacted his ability to govern, and by 1811 his son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was appointed as regent under the Regency Act. The political instability created by George III's mental illness significantly shaped his final years, and the creation of his will was an important step in outlining the governance of Britain during his incapacitation. The will, signed on the 21st of November 1810, has become a historical document of profound importance in understanding the later years of the Georgian monarchy, especially as it relates to the functioning of the royal family and the British government during the Regency. The key provisions of George III's will. Regency Arrangements. The central purpose of George III's will was to ensure that the governance of Britain continued despite the king's failing mental health. The document made clear that if George III was incapacitated or unfit to rule, that his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, would take over the royal duties as regent. This was not a new arrangement, but rather a formalization of the existing situation, given that the king's mental faculties were increasingly compromised by 1810. The will confirmed George IV, then the Prince of Wales, as the regent, granting him authority to act on behalf of the king in matters of state. This was crucial as it solidified the prince's role in the regency, which was already being anticipated by Parliament and the public. The regency would officially begin in 1811, following the Prince of Wales' assumption of the role after George III's mental health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer effectively fulfill his royal duties. The regency lasted until George III's death in 1820, during which time the Prince Regent exercised full sovereign authority, although often clashing with political figures and his own family. George III's will maintained the established line of succession to the throne. It confirmed that upon his death, the crown would pass to the eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who would become George IV. As George III's children were his closest heirs, the will solidified the royal succession, which had been an ongoing concern due to the health of the king and the future of the monarchy. The king's will marked the formal recognition of George IV as the next monarch, and the document was seen as both a legal and political confirmation of his position as the rightful heir. His succession was significant not only because it secured the monarchy for the next generation, but also because it highlighted the deep tensions between father and son. Despite being a prominent figure in British society, George IV had a difficult relationship with his father, marked by personal animosity and ideological differences. The will did not directly address these tensions, but it effectively placed the Prince of Wales in the position of power. Another crucial aspect of the will was the management of the king's estates, wealth, and royal finances. George III had extensive properties and income sources, including royal palaces, lands, and investments. The will outlined how these assets would be distributed among his surviving children, though it gave special financial positions to the Prince Regent. The king's finances were carefully managed during the Regency, as George III had concerns over his son's extravagant spending habits. However, the will provided George IV with a substantial income, which he then used to maintain his lavish lifestyle. George IV was granted funds sufficient to uphold his position as regent, though this did not stop the prince from engaging in often costly adventures, including numerous building projects and his extravagant court. The will also made provisions for George III's other surviving children, including the Duke of York, the Duke of Cumberland, and the other royal siblings. These provisions ensured that George III's children had the financial support necessary to live in accordance with their royal status, though it was George IV who became the central financial beneficiary of the royal estate. The financial provisions of the will reflected the complicated relationship between George III's immediate family and the royal finances. The Prince Regent's often excessive spending strained the royal budget, which only heightened tensions within the family, particularly with George IV's siblings and political figures who disagreed with his lavish spending. While George III's mental illness was never explicitly stated in his will, the document made provision for how governance should proceed during periods of his incapacity. The king's mental state had been deteriorating for several years before the will was drafted, and by 1810 it had become apparent that he would be unable to fulfil his royal duties to an extended period. The will does not directly mention his illness, which was a matter of both personal and political sensitivity. The exact cause of the king's illness was not fully understood at the time, and there was very little public acknowledgement of its true nature. His illness remained largely a private matter within the royal family, though it was increasingly becoming a public concern. Despite the lack of acknowledgement in the will, the Regency Arrangements effectively sidelined George III from public life, and George IV assumed power as regent. The will, therefore, served as a legal tool to manage the monarchy during George III's incapacity, without directly confronting the issue of his mental health. The King's will provides insight into his complex relationships with his family, especially his son, the Prince of Wales. George III and George IV had a tumultuous relationship, marked by political disagreements and personal animosity. The Prince Regent, in particular, was often seen as a dissenter and rival to his father, though the Regency Act and the will made it clear that George IV would eventually take the throne. Despite the Prince of Wales being confirmed as regent, George III was known to disapprove of his son's extravagant lifestyle, political ambitions, and his personal behaviour. The financial provisions in the will indicated that George III recognised his son's need for substantial funds, but also imposed limits on how these funds could be used. The will did not address the emotional distance between George III and his other children. While George III's surviving children were provided for, his strained relationship with his eldest son overshadowed much of his later life. Upon George III's death in 1820, his son George IV ascended the throne, but his reign was marked by ongoing political tensions and royal dissatisfaction. The Regency period itself had been fraught with personal and political conflict, and the legacy of George III's will played a significant role in shaping the future of the monarchy. The financial implications of the will continued to affect the royal family for years to come. George IV's lavish spending habits and the political ramifications of his role as regent created tensions within the family, but the monarchy itself remained stable.